Welcome to our Scripps News Group's special coverage of the passing of Pope Francis. I'm Joe St. George. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, we'll provide some insight into the life and legacy of the Holy Father, known for his compassion, humility, and at times progressive views. As tributes begin to pour in from around the world, the Catholic Church now prepares not only to remember the life of Pope Francis, but it also prepares for its next chapter at a pivotal moment for the Roman Catholic Church. But first, Scripps News Group's Amber Strong with a look back at the life of Pope Francis.
Before earning the moniker the People's Pope, Pope Francis was born in 1936 as Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the Argentine-born son of Italian immigrants. As a youth, he worked as a bar bouncer at a nightclub and considered a career in chemistry before entering Jesuit school in 1958. There, he rose through the ranks, becoming a priest, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and finally a cardinal in 2001. He took his place in the papacy in 2013 as the first Latin American and first Jesuit pope. His namesake was after St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of the poor, a name he worked to live up to, paying his own hotel bills and urging people not to travel to Rome to celebrate his rise to pope, but to give that money instead to the poor. Much of his teachings were focused on the impoverished, denouncing certain tenets of capitalism in early writings, remarking, "How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points?" He also worked to bring attention to the environment in his writings, calling the planet our common home and seeking to reconcile the call of the faithful to stewardship of the earth. But he struggled to deal with a church marred by financial scandal and global allegations of sex abuse and cover-ups. In 2018, he took a small step in reconciliation, apologizing to abuse survivors after defending a Chilean bishop accused of turning a blind eye to abuse. The next year, Pope Francis formally defrocked Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, who was accused of abusing men and children for decades. And he helped establish a handbook that encouraged clergy members to report sexual abuse allegations to legal authorities. He also addressed other areas of contention, including the role of women in the church, placing women in more senior roles at the Vatican, and apologizing to Indigenous people in Canada who'd been abused by Catholic-run schools. Perhaps his most celebrated and scrutinized actions surrounded his views on LGBTQ people and same-sex marriage. He made headlines in 2016 after saying the church should apologize to the person who is gay whom it has offended, and encouraging parents to welcome their LGBTQ children. In 2023, the Vatican stated that transgender people could be baptized under certain circumstances, a shift in previous positions. His inclusive stances and focus on issues of social justice often put him at odds with more conservative members of the church. In 2023, Bishop Joseph Strickland, a conservative and frequent critic of the Pope, was relieved of duty following an investigation. Francis didn't shy away from international political conflicts, placing himself at the center of Russia's war with Ukraine, allowing a Ukrainian and Russian woman to participate together in Easter services, and repeatedly calling for an end to the violence. He also met with Israeli and Palestinian families impacted by the war, praying for both sides and calling the conflict terrorism, a comment that stirred controversy in Israel. Later in his papacy, he was frequently hospitalized and suffered from nerve pain, mobility issues, and respiratory illnesses. Francis hinted at stepping down in 2022, saying the door was open to a resignation, and, quote, "It's not strange, it's not a catastrophe. You can change the Pope." Amber Strong, Scripps News.
This is the first time that a sitting pope has died since 2005, but in many ways what happens next for the Roman Catholic Church is a period of time rooted in tradition that goes back centuries. When the leader of the Roman Catholic Church passes away, a meticulously planned protocol unfolds in a delicate balance of tradition, faith, and timely action. It typically begins when the papal physician announces the time of death, with the public usually being formally notified by the Cardinal Camerlengo, the cardinal who is officially in charge of the Vatican until a new pope is elected. What happens next is known in Italian as the Novendiale, a 9-day mourning period, which includes opportunities for the public to say goodbye. It concludes with a funeral, usually in St. Peter's Square, where leaders from around the world will attend. A pope's final resting place can be anywhere in the world, but since the current St. Peter's Basilica was completed in the 1600s, 24 of the 31 deceased popes have been buried there. But Pope Francis has expressed a desire to be buried elsewhere at a basilica in Rome devoted to Mary. As the mourning period concludes, preparations for the conclave, the assembly of cardinals to elect a new pope, begin. Media blackouts by the Vatican are enacted. Only cardinals intending on participating will enter the conclave, sealing them off from the outside world. Once convened in the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals take an oath of secrecy and commit to a prayerful selection process. They will gather, discuss, and ultimately cast their votes in private. The voting requires a 2/3 majority to elect the new pope, and if no candidate receives the necessary votes after several rounds, the cardinals may resort to shorter voting periods or consider potential compromise candidates. In rounds where no one gets the 2/3 majority, the votes are burned with a chemical that creates black smoke that can be seen by the faithful gathering outside in St. Peter's Square. When a new pope is elected, white smoke signals the announcement to the world. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the new pope must choose his name. When Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio became pope, he chose Francis in honor of his desire to serve the poor. To announce the new pope, cardinals will emerge before the assembled crowd in St. Peter's Square. Habemus Papam will be proclaimed, Latin for "we have a pope." The newly elected pontiff will then deliver his first blessing and address the public.
Buonasera.
The death of the pope is more than just a transition. It's a moment of reflection, reverence, and ultimately renewal for the nearly 1.3 billion Catholics around the globe. Through an intricate dance of tradition and faith, each transition leads to the next chapter in the story of the Catholic Church. Upon his election to the papacy, Pope Francis made history as the first pope to hail from Latin America. Scripps News Group's global affairs correspondent Maya Rodriguez with a closer look at Pope Francis's impact on the Spanish-speaking world.
Pope Francis became the first pope born or raised outside of Europe since the 8th century. After battling a severe illness as a young man, he joined the Jesuit order in Argentina. And it's his roots in Latin America that signaled one particular change in the Catholic Church. With the seat of the Holy See located squarely within the borders of Europe, historically, most of its popes hailed from that continent too. That is, until Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis in 2013, a point of pride for Catholics in his hometown of Buenos Aires, Argentina.
I knew Pope Francis, at the time named Bergoglio, many years ago. I knew him when he washed feet in the neighborhood for Holy Week.
I saw him when I was a little girl, and he would give masses in this church.
Pope Francis's rise from there to head of the Vatican was seismic, experts say.
The election of Pope Francis signaled a very significant, I would say, monumental change in the Catholic Church.
Father Alan Figueroa Deck is a distinguished scholar of theology at Loyola Marymount University. He says Pope Francis's ascension to the papacy showed a shift within the church itself.
With the election of Pope Francis, the Catholic Church really became a church open to all peoples, or moved more in that direction, because it began to recognize that the majority of the Catholics were now in the global South.
In all, there are 1.36 billion Catholics around the world. According to the Vatican, nearly half, 48% of them, live in the Americas. But the increased attention on Catholics in Latin America, brought by Pope Francis's time as pontiff, hasn't necessarily translated into a growing flock within the Hispanic community in the United States. A 2022 study by the Pew Research Center found that 43% of Hispanic adults in the U.S. identify as Catholic. That's down from 67% in 2010. The study also found there's a gap when it comes to Catholicism among Hispanic immigrants versus those born here in the United States. Among Hispanic immigrants, 52% identify as Catholic, But for Hispanic adults born in the U.S., only 36% identify as Catholic. Experts say trying to grow the numbers of Catholic Hispanics and Catholics in the Americas is not an easy task.
The world in which we live, and Latin America is included in it, is a world that's characterized by pluralism. People are being exposed to new ideas and new attitudes that sometimes the traditional religion has not been able to work with very well, or been able to accept very much, or understand adequately.
A challenge that remains, and one that now awaits the next pope. Brazil has the largest Catholic population in the world, followed by the Philippines and the United States. But where the Catholic Church is seeing the most growth is in Africa. There are nearly 330 million Catholics now living on that continent. Maya Rodriguez, Scripps News Group, Washington.
We'll be right back. For more perspective on the legacy of Pope Francis and where the Roman Catholic Church goes from here, we're joined by Stephen White. He's the executive director of the Catholic Project here at the Catholic University of America, where we're broadcasting from. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
I know that the legacy of popes, it can sometimes take decades or centuries to fully appreciate what they did. At this moment, though, what is the legacy of Pope Francis?
Well, I think back to when he first became Pope and his focus on the poor, his taking of the name Francis. I think to the first homily he gave the morning after he was elected, and he spoke to the men, the cardinals who had just elected him Pope, and he spoke of the importance of walking together, of building, but above all of preaching Christ. And he said, if we don't proclaim Christ, then we're not truly Christian, and we're not doing our job. We're not fulfilling our mission as apostles. And I think that legacy of proclaiming the gospel, in particular through care for the poor, will be at the heart of his legacy now and for many years to come.
He was controversial, though, at times, because I know people in the church who say that maybe Pope Francis made them a little more conservative, a little more Latin Mass. Can you speak to the division that exists in the Catholic Church, and no doubt will be part of this upcoming conclave?
Yeah, I think the divisions that we saw during this pontificate were less caused by Pope Francis than perhaps revealed by him. I think there was something about the way he governed and the priorities he set that revealed some division that had pre-existed him. I think that will continue to play out in the years and maybe decades to come. I think there are things you can say about how he handled that were good and some that were bad. But I think by and large, those tensions remain in the church, and the church is going to be dealing with them for many years to come.
Did the media get Pope Francis wrong? Because I'm thinking back to when the Jesuit from Argentina became priest. People were talking about women becoming deacons and perhaps same-sex marriage getting more rights. None of that really transpired. Did the media get a lot of Pope Francis wrong?
I think there were a lot of people who had certain expectations for what he would and would not do, and I think he frustrated a lot of those expectations. I think when he talked so much about reform, talked so much about changing the way the church did things, people thought that was to accommodate the church to the world, and there was some degree to which that was done. I think his focus was always on how do we evangelize better? How do we let the freshness of the gospel shine through? The joy of the gospel is one of the phrases he talked about a lot. And that was always the core of what he was trying to do, I think. And I think sometimes the expectations for what he might do, whether you thought those things were going to be good or bad, I think those expectations were sometimes overwrought.
What's the health of the church right now? And I'm curious what the health of the church may be globally and here in the United States, because I'm a Catholic. I go to church on most Sundays. Church looks pretty empty on most Sundays.
Yeah, well, it depends on where you are. To ask what is the state of the church globally is to ask a very, very complicated and difficult question. The church is growing globally, particularly in places like Africa and Asia. In some of the parts of the church that have been sort of the longest homes of Christianity, especially Latin Christianity, Western Christianity, the church is struggling. You see this especially in Western Europe. You see this to a slightly different degree, but with following some similarities here in the United States. And I think that's a great challenge of how the church responds to the challenges of modernity. That's a challenge that pre-existed Pope Francis. Is one that he tried to respond to with mixed results, and it's one that the church continues to face. I think at the heart of sort of renewal in the church and revitalization of the church remains a simple equation, which is that sort of elaborate programs from the top down are not how the church grows. It's never been that way. The church grows by people, individuals or small groups responding radically to the challenge of the gospel. If we Christians live that way, the church will grow. And I think that's always been the hope for the church. That's always been the strength of the church's evangelizing mission. And that mission seems to be sputtering most in the parts of the world that are the wealthiest, the most comfortable, perhaps the most decadent. I think underscores the need for that kind of radical response. If there's a hope to grow the church, it lies in that, living the truth of the Christian faith with integrity.
As you know, the church is still recovering from the child sex abuse scandal. You study the church, you certainly talk about the church a lot here at the Catholic University of America. What is one thing that Pope Francis did to maybe not move on from that chapter, but help heal the divisions that it created? Some people left the church forever because of that period of time.
Yeah, that moment in the church's life, not the first time, but in 2018 into 2019, when sort of the latest wave of the abuse crisis swept over the church, not just here in the United States, not just here in Washington, but globally. I think it's important to remember that the global church's response to and sort of attempts to tackle the abuse crisis, in a lot of ways the church in the United States is 2 decades ahead of the rest of the church. So while some of the reforms of Pope Francis may seem to Americans to not have changed much, I think globally the change was much more significant. I think particularly of the law that he passed in early 2019, Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which sought to put in place measures for episcopal accountability. What do you do when a bishop himself has perpetrated abuse or covered up abuse? And that law, I think, is a good law. The challenge is to enforce those laws with equanimity and with transparency, and that's been a much bigger struggle.
Stephen, some might say that we have a compassion deficit in our society. I don't know if it's because of social media or what we see on our television screens these days. Is there a role for the Pope to address that? Did Pope Francis get at that enough?
Yeah, I think this was something he actually emphasized very well. In a lot of his writings, particularly in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, he talked about the common fraternity of all human beings. One of the challenges of the world we live in today is with social media and with in a lot of different ways, we're lacking in sort of personal one-on-one encounters. And I think you encounter someone and you respond to them differently through social media or through the medium of our technology than you do when you encounter someone in person. It's easier to get along with and care for someone and be compassionate toward them when you see them face to face, when you know their name. And the more our interactions are mediated in the various ways that they are today, I think it becomes easier to see people as sort of an anonymous person on the internet to encounter, rather than a person who's standing before you with that personal connection. I think is sometimes lacking. If there's a compassion deficit, I think that's one area it comes from. That's certainly what Pope Francis talked about often.
Stephen White, Executive Director of the Catholic Project at the Catholic University of America. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Joe.
And we'll continue our coverage here on Scripps News right after this. Before we go, standing here at the Theological College at the Catholic University of America, overlooking the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, I'm reminded of Pope Francis's visit here way back in 2015. I was lucky enough to cover that visit for the Scripps News Group while I was working at our Richmond, Virginia station at the time. It was early in my career, but even then I knew that it was a unique assignment, a special assignment, because quite frankly, it was. I still remember seeing teenagers cry and mothers weep, Catholics and non-Catholics from all walks of life. I still think of those who were at that Mass, who just felt a sense of gratitude to be in Pope Francis's presence.
Just incredible. He's so genuine.
He's an inspiration.
It's an experience I'll always remember, even if this guy probably won't remember it at all.
It's magical.
Given our politically charged climate these days, I'm also reminded of what Pope Francis told Congress during that 2015 visit, including some lawmakers who are still shaping and reshaping our world. This is what the Holy Father said about immigrants and immigration so many years ago.
When the stranger in our midst appeals to us, we must not repeat the sins and the errors of the past. We, the people of this continent, are not fearful of foreigners, because most of us were once foreigners.
A standing ovation by Republicans and Democrats. A rare sight then, perhaps an even rarer sight now. But in many ways, that is the power and legacy of Pope Francis, bringing people together who might otherwise be foes. I'm Joe St. George, Scripps News Group, Washington.